The first gunshot rang out at dawn, shattering the silence along Riverton's dusty Main Street. But Wyatt Jameson didn't flinch. Death had long been his only faithful companion. The year was 1876, and Riverton, Wyoming Territory, sat nestled between the rolling prairies and the distant silhouette of mountains that promised escape. Once a booming trading post along the Sweetwater River, the town had grown with the westward expansion, though it retained much of its frontier roughness. For Wyatt, it was merely another stop, another place to hide from memories that pursued him with more determination than any bounty hunter ever could. At 34, Wyatt's face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd seen too much of life's cruelty. His dark beard, flecked with premature gray, concealed a jaw that rarely relaxed. Only his eyes, deep blue like a mountain lake, revealed anything of the man he'd once been, before loss and violence had hollowed him out. The commotion down the street barely registered as Wyatt sipped his morning coffee on the hotel's porch. Two drunks settling scores from the previous night's poker game. Nothing unusual. Sheriff Mills would sort it out. Wyatt had his own troubles: dwindling funds, a horse that needed shoeing, and the persistent emptiness that no whiskey could fill. "Those fools will kill each other one of these days," remarked Harold, the hotel owner, as he swept the wooden boards beside Wyatt. "Not my concern," Wyatt replied, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. Harold shook his head. "Cold as winter steel, ain't you? Reckon that's why they call you the Ghost." Wyatt didn't correct him. The nickname had followed him through 3 territories now. The Ghost, a man more dead than alive, moving through the world without leaving a trace, without forming attachments. It suited him fine. "Miss Johansson's arriving today," Harold continued, undeterred by Wyatt's silence. "Coming to take over her uncle's medical practice now that Doc Stevens has passed." Wyatt grunted in response. Another newcomer, another person who'd learned to avoid his gaze. He drained his cup and stood, eager to escape the innkeeper's chatter. "She's coming all the way from Boston," Harold pressed on. "Educated woman. Don't know how she'll take to our little town." "She won't last a month," Wyatt muttered, settling his hat firmly on his head. Refined Eastern women never did. The West had ways of sending them scurrying back to civilization. The stagecoach wasn't due until afternoon, giving Wyatt plenty of time to attend to his business. He needed work. Ranch hands were always in demand, but he preferred jobs that kept him moving. Guarding shipments, tracking stolen horses, anything that didn't require putting down roots. The livery stable smelled of hay and horse, comforting in its familiarity. Thomas, the blacksmith, looked up from his forge as Wyatt entered. "Jameson," he acknowledged with a nod. "Your mare's ready." "Fine animal." "She'll do," Wyatt said, approaching the stall where his chestnut mare waited. Midnight was the only living creature he allowed himself to care for. She'd carried him through blizzards and deserts alike, never complaining, never demanding more than he could give. Thomas wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Sheriff's looking for you, says he might have work." Wyatt's interest peaked slightly. Sheriff Mills was a fair man and his work usually paid well. "I'll stop by." After settling his account with Thomas, Wyatt led Midnight out into the spring sunshine. The town was coming to life now, shopkeepers opening their doors, women heading to the general store, children racing to the schoolhouse. Normal lives, ordinary concerns. Wyatt observed it all with detachment, like watching a play he had no part in. The sheriff's office was a sturdy brick building at the end of Main Street. Mills was at his desk, spectacles perched on his nose as he read through wanted posters. "Jameson," he said without looking up. "Heard you were looking for work." "Might be," Wyatt replied, leaning against the doorframe. "Depends on what you're offering." Mills finally raised his eyes. Got a request from the Carson Ranch. They've lost 20 head of cattle in the last month. Thinking it might be rustlers operating out of the Badlands. And they'll pay good money to whoever can track down the thieves and recover what's left of their stock. Wyatt considered it. Cattle rustlers were dangerous, desperate men. The job could take weeks, requiring him to track them into harsh territory. Perfect. When do they want me to start? Mills seemed relieved. Sooner the better. Carson's sending his foreman into town tomorrow to meet whoever takes the job. Wyatt nodded. I'll talk to him. As he turned to leave, Mills called after him. Jameson, he paused. Try bringing him back alive this time. The territory's trying to establish law and order, proper trials, that sort of thing. A ghost of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. I'll keep that in mind. Outside, the town had grown busier. Wyatt led Midnight toward the general store, intending to stock up on supplies before tomorrow's meeting. The sound of the approaching stagecoach made him glance toward the far end of the street, right on schedule. The coach rolled in, dust billowing behind it as the driver called for the horses to halt in front of the hotel. Curious townsfolk gathered to see what newcomers might emerge. Wyatt wouldn't have paid attention, except that Harold's earlier comments had planted a seed of curiosity. What kind of woman left Boston to practice medicine in a place like Riverton? The driver jumped down to open the door. First came an elderly couple, blinking in the bright sunlight. Then a young man in a suit too fine for the dusty streets. And finally, her. She didn't look like a doctor. That was Wyatt's first thought as he watched her step carefully down from the coach. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26. Her dress was practical for travel but still unmistakably Eastern in its style. Chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and even from a distance, Wyatt could see she held herself with quiet confidence. Clara Johansson surveyed her new home with an expression Wyatt couldn't quite read, not the disdain he'd anticipated, nor the fear that often characterized newcomers. Instead, she seemed to be taking mental notes, cataloging the town with clinical precision. Harold rushed forward to greet her, all smiles and exaggerated courtesy. Other townspeople followed, eager to meet the woman who would be taking over Doc Stevens' practice. Wyatt turned away. Let them welcome her. He'd be gone tomorrow anyway, tracking rustlers in the Badlands. But as he led Midnight toward the general store, he heard someone call out, Miss Johansson, your bags. Wyatt glanced back to see the driver struggling with several heavy trunks. The woman Clara was trying to help, but Harold was insisting she leave such work to others. Nonsense, she replied, her voice clear and determined. I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own belongings. There was something refreshing about her practical attitude, something that made Wyatt pause longer than he intended. When she looked up suddenly and caught his gaze, he felt an unfamiliar jolt. Her eyes were remarkably direct, assessing him with the same careful attention she'd given the town. Wyatt turned abruptly away, irritated by his own interest. She was just another Easterner who'd soon learn that life out here wasn't like the dime novels. Medicine in Riverton meant treating gunshot wounds, childbirth in remote cabins, and diseases with limited supplies. She'd be gone before winter. Still, as he entered the general store, he couldn't quite shake the impression of those clear, intelligent eyes, studying him as if he were a puzzle she intended to solve. Clara Johansson spent her first afternoon in Riverton setting up her uncle's former office. The building was small but sturdy, with a front room for receiving patients and a back room that held medical supplies, a cot for examinations, and a small desk. Living quarters upstairs consisted of 2 modest rooms, a bedroom, and a sitting area with a small stove for cooking. It was nothing like the Boston hospital where she trained, but Clara had known what to expect. Her uncle's letters had been detailed, painting a realistic picture of frontier medicine's challenges. What he hadn't mentioned was the resistance she might face as a female doctor. Folks around here aren't used to lady physicians, Mrs. Wilkins had explained while helping Clara unpack her medical books. The older woman had been her uncle's assistant and had agreed to stay on, at least temporarily. Some won't take to it at all. Then they can continue suffering, Clara had replied matter-of-factly. Or they can accept that medicine doesn't care about the gender of the person administering it. Mrs. Wilkins had smiled at that. You're Stevens through and through. He was just as stubborn. Now, as dusk fell over Riverton, Clara sat at her uncle's desk, her desk now reviewing his patient notes. The handwriting grew shakier in the final entries, evidence of the heart condition that had eventually taken his life. She'd come too late to save him, but perhaps not too late to continue his work. A knock at the door startled her. Mrs. Wilkins had gone home for the evening, leaving Clara alone. "Come in," she called, quickly composing herself. The door opened to reveal Sheriff Mills, a man she'd met briefly upon arrival. "Evening, Miss Johansson. Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Sheriff. Please sit down." She gestured to the chair across from her. "How can I help you?" Mills removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "Just wanted to check that you're settling in all right. Riverton's a good town, but it can be rough around the edges." "I'm finding everything satisfactory, thank you." The sheriff nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good, good. Also wanted to let you know that we have something of a welcoming tradition for new folks in town. The hotel restaurant hosts a dinner. Nothing fancy, but it gives everyone a chance to meet you proper-like." Clara hesitated. She had intended to spend her first evening organizing the office, but she understood the importance of community acceptance for her practice to succeed. "That sounds lovely. When is this dinner to take place?" "Tonight, actually. About an hour from now." Mills looked slightly embarrassed. "Short notice, I know, but Harold's wife insists on feeding you a proper meal after your journey." Clara smiled. "Then I would be delighted to attend. Thank you for the invitation." After the sheriff left, Clara quickly changed into one of her better dresses, a deep blue wool that was practical yet flattering. She arranged her hair simply and collected her shawl. The spring evenings in Wyoming were still chilly compared to what she was accustomed to in Boston. The hotel restaurant was already bustling when she arrived. It seemed most of Riverton had turned out to meet her. Clara took a deep breath, reminding herself why she had come west. Her uncle's death had left a void in this community, one she was determined to fill, despite the obstacles she would face as a woman in medicine. Harold's wife, a robust woman with a quick smile, ushered her to a place of honor at the head table. "Everyone's been so eager to meet you," she explained, introducing Clara to what seemed like a blur of faces and names. Clara did her best to remember each one. The banker, Mr. Patterson. The school teacher, Miss Evans. The young telegraph operator, David. Each would be potential patients, and in a town this size, personal connections mattered. As the meal was served, Clara noticed a solitary figure at a corner table, partially hidden in shadow. The man from earlier, the one with the intense gaze who'd been watching her arrival. Unlike the others, he made no attempt to introduce himself, seemingly content to observe from a distance. "Who is that man?" she asked Mrs. Wilkins, who was seated beside her. Mrs. Wilkins followed her gaze and frowned slightly. "That's Wyatt Jameson. Best not to concern yourself with him." "Is he dangerous?" "Not exactly. He's complicated, keeps to himself mostly, works odd jobs, dangerous ones usually. Some call him the ghost." "The ghost," Clara repeated, intrigued despite herself. "On account of how he moves through life. Here today, gone tomorrow, never stays anywhere long. Never gets close to anybody." Mrs. Wilkins lowered her voice. "They say he lost his family years back, wife and child both, to raiders. Never been the same since. Clara studied the solitary figure with new interest. There was something in his posture that spoke of more than mere aloofness, a deliberate distance, as if he'd built walls so high even he couldn't see over them anymore. "He looks like he could use a friend," she observed. Mrs. Wilkins patted her hand. "That's kind of you, dear, but some men can't be reached. Jameson's made his peace with solitude. Best to respect that." But Clara had never been one to accept limitations easily, whether in medicine or in human connections. As dinner progressed, she found her attention repeatedly drawn to the quiet man in the corner, wondering about the story behind those guarded eyes. When the meal ended and people began to mingle, Clara noticed Wyatt slipping toward the door. Acting on impulse, she made her way through the crowd to intercept him. "Mr. Jameson," she said, extending her hand. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Clara Johansson." Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might have been handsome if not for its hard edges. His eyes, she now saw, were a striking blue, though they regarded her with cool detachment. After a moment's hesitation, he took her offered hand briefly. "Miss Johansson, I understand you do tracking work," she continued, undeterred by his obvious desire to escape. "My uncle mentioned in his letters that medical emergencies often happen in remote areas. Perhaps someday I might need a guide." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that she was addressing him directly while others gave him a wide berth. "There are better guides," he said finally. "But are there better trackers?" she challenged. The ghost of a smile touched his lips, so briefly she might have imagined it. "No," he admitted. "Then I'll keep you in mind, Mr. Jameson." He studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to decipher her motives. "I won't be around much, heading out tomorrow." "Oh, where to?" "Badlands." "Job for the Carson Ranch." Clara nodded, storing this information away. "Well, I wish you safe travels, and should you return with any injuries, my door is always open." Wyatt seemed about to say something more, but then merely touched the brim of his hat in a silent farewell before slipping out into the night, making friends with the ghost. Sheriff Mills had appeared at her elbow, his expression caught between amusement and concern. "Just introducing myself," Clara replied. "Is there some reason I shouldn't?" Mills sighed. "No, I suppose not. Jameson's a good man in his way, just damaged. Been that way since I've known him, going on 5 years now." "What happened to him?" Mrs. Wilkins mentioned a family. The sheriff's expression grew solemn. "Not my story to tell, but I will say this: men like Jameson, they carry their ghosts with them, makes them hard to reach." Clara thought of her medical training, of patients deemed beyond help by other doctors. "In my experience, Sheriff, no one is beyond reach. Some just require more patience than others." Little did she know how much patience Wyatt Jameson would require, or how deeply his wounded soul would eventually touch her own. The next morning dawned clear and cool as Wyatt prepared for his meeting with the Carson Ranch foreman. He'd slept poorly, his dreams haunted by memories he usually managed to keep at bay, and oddly, by a pair of direct, intelligent eyes that had regarded him without fear or judgment. He shook off the discomfort. Clara Johansson was just another Easterner who'd learn the harsh realities of frontier life soon enough. Her friendly overture meant nothing. Likely she was simply being polite to everyone on her first night in town. The meeting with Carson's foreman went as expected. Jeff Bailey was a no-nonsense cowman who gave Wyatt the details straight. 23 cattle missing over the past month, tracks leading northeast toward the Badlands, and evidence suggesting at least 5 men involved in the rustling operation. "Mr. Carson's offering $500 if you can recover the cattle," Bailey explained. "Extra 100 if you bring in the rustlers alive for trial." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "Seems Carson's confident in my abilities." Bailey shrugged. Sheriff recommended you. Said you've got a knack for tracking that most men don't. They settled on terms, with Wyatt receiving a partial payment up front for supplies. He'd need enough provisions for potentially 2 weeks in rough country, plus ammunition and medical supplies. The rustlers wouldn't surrender without a fight. As Wyatt left the sheriff's office, supply list in hand, he found himself walking toward the general store when a commotion further down the street caught his attention. A crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office, Clara's office now, and raised voices suggested something was wrong. He should have continued on his way. Whatever was happening wasn't his concern. Yet he found himself changing direction, drawn by curiosity he couldn't justify to himself. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, people always instinctively making way for him. At the center of the disturbance stood Clara Johansson, her posture tense but determined as she faced a red-faced man Wyatt recognized as Frank Wilson, one of the local ranchers. "I don't care what fancy education you got back east," Wilson was saying, his voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "My boy needs a real doctor, not some woman playing at medicine." Clara's voice, in contrast, remained calm and measured. "Mr. Wilson, your son's appendix has ruptured. He needs immediate surgery or he will die. I am fully qualified to perform this procedure. You ain't touching him. We'll take him to Laramie." "He won't survive the journey," Clara stated flatly. "The infection is spreading rapidly. Mrs." Wilson emerged from the doctor's office, her face streaked with tears. "Frank, please, Tommy's burning up with fever. The doctor says we don't have time. She ain't a doctor," Wilson roared. "No real doctor would be a what, Mr. Wilson?" Clara interrupted, her eyes flashing. "A woman. I assure you, my gender has no bearing on my ability to save your son's life." The standoff continued, with Wilson stubbornly refusing and his wife becoming increasingly distraught. The boy's life hung in the balance while his father's pride stood in the way of necessary treatment. Wyatt found himself stepping forward before he'd made a conscious decision to intervene. "Wilson," he said, his quiet voice somehow cutting through the tension, "you're being a fool." All eyes turned to him in surprise. Wyatt rarely involved himself in town matters. "This ain't your business, Jameson," Wilson snapped, though with noticeably less conviction than he'd shown toward Clara. "Maybe not," Wyatt agreed. "But I've seen men die of gut wounds in the field, slow, painful death. That what you want for your boy?" Wilson's face paled slightly. "Of course not, but then let the doctor do her job." Wyatt met Clara's startled gaze for a brief moment. "I've known plenty of men with medical training who couldn't save a dying cat. It's skill that matters, not whether someone wears trousers or skirts." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Mrs." Wilson seized the moment, grabbing her husband's arm. "Please, Frank, for Tommy." The fight seemed to drain out of Wilson. He looked from his wife's tearful face to Clara's determined one, then finally gave a curt nod. "Fine, but I'm staying right there watching every move." "As is your right," Clara replied evenly. "Now, if we've wasted enough time, I'd like to save your son's life." As the Wilsons followed Clara inside, the crowd began to disperse. Wyatt turned to leave, uncomfortable with the attention his unexpected intervention had drawn. "Mr. Jameson." He paused at the sound of Mrs. Wilkins' voice. The older woman approached him with a grateful expression. "Thank you for that. Frank Wilson's a stubborn man, but he respects you. Your words made a difference." Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. "The boy shouldn't suffer for his father's pride." "Mrs." Wilkins studied him thoughtfully. "Dr. Clara's going to need allies here. Not everyone will accept a woman physician easily." "I'm leaving town today," Wyatt reminded her. "Won't be much help to anyone." "But you'll be back," she said with surprising certainty. "You always come back to Riverton, even when there are other towns you could drift to." Wyatt had no response to that uncomfortable truth. Riverton was the closest thing to a home base he'd allowed himself in years, though he'd never examined why too closely. The boy going to make it? He asked instead. Mrs. Wilkins sighed. It's serious. Appendix cases can go either way once they've ruptured, but if anyone can save him, it's Clara. She trained under some of Boston's finest surgeons. Wyatt nodded, oddly reassured by this information. Good luck to her, then. With that, he continued toward the general store, trying to ignore the strange feeling that he'd just involved himself in something he couldn't easily walk away from. Hours later, after purchasing supplies and ensuring Midnight was well rested for their journey, Wyatt found himself passing the doctor's office again on his way out of town. He told himself it was merely the most direct route, not any concern for the outcome of young Tommy Wilson's surgery. To his surprise, Clara herself emerged from the building just as he approached. She looked exhausted, her sleeves rolled up and her apron stained with evidence of her work. Yet when she saw him, her face brightened slightly. "Mr. Jameson, I hoped I might see you before you left." Wyatt reined Midnight to a stop. "The Wilson boy, he'll live," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "The infection was severe, but I was able to remove the ruptured appendix and clean the abdominal cavity thoroughly. He'll need careful monitoring, but I believe he'll make a full recovery." "Good," Wyatt said simply. Clara stepped closer, her expression becoming serious. "I wanted to thank you for your intervention earlier. Mr. Wilson might have cost his son his life if not for your words." Wyatt shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Just stated the obvious." "Sometimes the obvious needs stating, especially when emotions run high." She smiled slightly. "You're heading out now," he nodded. "Rustlers won't track themselves." "How long will you be gone?" The question surprised him. Few people asked about his comings and goings. "Hard to say." "A week, maybe 2. Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I wish you safe travels, Mr. Jameson. And my offer stands should you return with any injuries. My door is always open." "I don't get injured," he replied, the automatic response of a man who'd learned to tend his own wounds rather than seek help. She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Everyone gets injured, Mr. Jameson. The wise ones just seek proper treatment afterward." There was something disarming about her directness, about the way she seemed to see through his carefully constructed barriers. It made him uneasy and strangely curious. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally. Then, with a touch to his hat brim, he urged Midnight forward, eager to leave town and the unsettling presence of Clara Johansson behind. As Riverton faded into the distance, Wyatt tried to focus his thoughts on the task ahead, tracking the rustlers, recovering the cattle, earning his pay. Yet his mind kept returning to the determined young doctor and the way she'd faced down Wilson's anger without flinching. There was strength there, and something else, a genuine commitment to helping others that Wyatt had grown cynical about in his years of wandering. Such idealism wouldn't last, he told himself. The frontier had a way of grinding down even the most determined spirits. Clara Johansson would either harden or leave, just like everyone else. Still, as he made camp that first night under a vast Wyoming sky, Wyatt found himself wondering if she might prove to be the exception. And why, after all this time, he should care either way. The Badlands stretched before Wyatt like an alien landscape, all jagged ridges and deeply carved ravines. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barren terrain, creating an otherworldly beauty that belied the dangers hidden in its folds. He'd been tracking the rustlers for 5 days now, following signs that grew fresher as he closed the distance. They were good, he had to admit. They'd split the stolen herd into smaller groups, taking different routes before presumably meeting at some predetermined location. But Wyatt hadn't earned his reputation as a tracker by giving up on difficult trails. He'd followed the most promising signs, those of the largest group of cattle, trusting that they would lead him to the rustlers' main camp. Now, as he studied the valley below from his vantage point on a rocky outcropping, he knew his instincts had been correct. About a mile ahead, nestled in a box canyon that provided natural protection, smoke rose from what appeared to be a semi-permanent camp. Through his field glasses, Wyatt could make out crude corrals containing Carson's cattle, if the brands were anything to go by. He counted at least 4 men moving about the camp, though there could be others out of sight. Armed men, comfortable in their remote hideout. This wouldn't be easy. Wyatt retreated from the ridge, leading Midnight to a sheltered spot where he made a cold camp. No fire tonight. He couldn't risk the rustlers spotting smoke. As darkness fell, he ate jerky and hardtack, washing it down with water from his canteen. Not the most satisfying meal, but he'd had worse. His thoughts drifted unexpectedly to Riverton, to the comfortable hotel dining room where the town had welcomed Clara Johansson. He wondered how she was faring, whether the Wilson boy had continued to improve, whether she'd faced more resistance to her presence. Wyatt frowned, annoyed with himself for these distracting thoughts. What happened in town was none of his concern. He had a job to do, one that required his complete focus if he wanted to avoid adding his bones to the Badlands collection. Yet as he laid out his bedroll, he found himself remembering the determined set of Clara's jaw as she'd faced down Wilson, the quiet confidence in her voice when she'd stated, "I am fully qualified." There was something compelling about such certainty, especially in a world where most people were just fumbling their way forward, hoping for the best. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of wind through the strange rock formations. Wyatt dreamed of his wife, Sarah, as he sometimes did, not the terrible final moments that had haunted him for years, but earlier, happier times. In the dream, she was smiling at him across their small cabin table, their infant daughter asleep in her cradle nearby. "You deserve happiness, Wyatt," dreamed Sarah told him, her voice achingly familiar. "Why won't you allow yourself to find it?" He woke before dawn with her question lingering in his mind, an uncomfortable reminder of all he'd lost and all he'd refused to seek since. Pushing away the melancholy, Wyatt focused on his plan for the day ahead. The rustlers' camp would be most vulnerable at dawn, when night watches grew tired and others were just waking. Wyatt checked his Winchester and Colt, ensuring both were clean and loaded. Sheriff Mills had asked him to bring the rustlers in alive if possible, but Wyatt harbored no illusions about how these men would respond when cornered. He approached the camp from the east, using the rising sun at his back to his advantage. As expected, the rustlers were slow to rouse, with only one man keeping a half-hearted watch while warming himself by the rekindled fire. Wyatt observed the camp layout carefully. 4 men, as he'd counted yesterday, plus the stolen cattle in a makeshift corral. Their horses were picketed nearby. The canyon provided protection on 3 sides, with only one obvious entrance, the one Wyatt now overlooked from a ridge. A frontal assault would be suicide. He needed to create a distraction, something to divide their attention and give him an opening. The cattle provided that opportunity. Moving silently down to a position near the corral, Wyatt waited until the lookout wandered off to get coffee. Then, with precise aim, he fired 2 shots into the air just above the cattle. The effect was immediate. The already nervous animals bolted, breaking through the hasty fencing as they stampeded toward the canyon entrance. The rustlers scrambled in confusion, some reaching for guns while others tried desperately to stem the tide of escaping cattle. In the chaos, Wyatt made his move. He picked off one rustler with a shot to the leg, dropping him before he could reach his weapon. The second turned to fire at Wyatt but caught a bullet in the shoulder instead. The third and fourth, however, managed to find cover behind rocks and began returning fire. Bullets chipped stone near Wyatt's head as he ducked down, moving laterally to find a better angle. One of the remaining rustlers broke cover, making a dash for the horses. Wyatt's shot caught him in the thigh, sending him sprawling in the dust. "You're done," Wyatt called out to the last man. "Your friends are down, the cattle are gone. Surrender and you'll get a fair trial. Go to hell," came the predictable response, followed by more gunfire. Wyatt sighed. They never made it easy. Calculating the rustler's position from his gunshots, Wyatt circled around, using the terrain for cover until he had a clear view of the man's hiding place. "Last chance," he warned. The rustler's response was another wild shot in Wyatt's general direction. With practiced precision, Wyatt aimed and fired, his bullet finding the rustler's gun hand. The man screamed, his weapon falling uselessly to the ground. Within minutes, Wyatt had all 4 rustlers disarmed and secured, their wounds painful but not life-threatening exactly as he'd planned. They were a rough-looking bunch, exactly the sort of desperate men who turned to rustling when honest work seemed too difficult. "You've got a choice," Wyatt told them as he finished bandaging the last man's wounds. "I can leave you out here to die, or I can take you back to Riverton to stand trial. Either way, Carson's getting his cattle back." The oldest of the group, a weathered man with a gray-streaked beard, spat in the dust. "Ain't much of a choice." "More than you gave the cattle you stole," Wyatt replied evenly. "Besides, prison might be an improvement over this place." With the rustlers secured, Wyatt set about gathering the scattered cattle. It was slow work for one man, but he'd expected that. By mid-afternoon, he'd rounded up most of the stolen herd and started the long drive back toward more hospitable country, the bound rustlers riding their own horses under his watchful eye. That night, as they made camp well away from the Badlands, Wyatt kept his distance from the captured men. They weren't worth conversing with, and he had no interest in their stories or excuses. They'd chosen their path, just as he'd chosen his. Yet as he looked up at the star-filled sky, Wyatt found himself thinking again of Riverton, of the promise of a real bed at the hotel and a hot meal that wasn't cooked over a campfire. And, unbidden, the thought of a certain doctor with direct eyes and a determined chin. Just professional curiosity, he told himself. He'd intervened in her confrontation with Wilson. It was natural to wonder about the outcome. Nothing more. But deep down, in places he rarely examined, Wyatt knew he was lying to himself. Something about Clara Johansson had caught his attention in a way nothing had for years. Not her beauty, though she was certainly pleasing to look at, but something deeper, a strength of purpose, a conviction that what she was doing mattered. It had been a long time since anything had mattered to Wyatt Jameson beyond basic survival and the next job. The realization was unsettling enough that he deliberately pushed it away, focusing instead on the practical concerns of getting men and cattle safely back to civilization. Dreams of Sarah did not return that night, but in their place came newer, more confusing images of chestnut hair and determined eyes, of a voice that seemed to expect more from him than mere existence. Wyatt woke troubled, his usual emotional numbness disturbed by feelings he thought long dead. The journey back to Riverton took 4 days. 4 days of driving reluctant cattle across challenging terrain. 4 days of watching sullen prisoners who would have killed him given half a chance. 4 days of unexpected thoughts about a woman he barely knew. By the time the town appeared on the horizon, Wyatt had firmly reminded himself of all the reasons he avoided attachments. He would deliver the rustlers to Sheriff Mills, the cattle to Carson's ranch, collect his payment, and move on. Perhaps it was time to try Montana or Idaho for a while. Distance would restore his equilibrium. It was late afternoon when they finally reached town. People stopped to stare at the unusual procession, Wyatt Jameson leading 4 bound men and a herd of cattle down Main Street toward the sheriff's office. Word spread quickly, and by the time they reached their destination, a small crowd had gathered. Sheriff Mills emerged from his office, eyebrows rising at the sight. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually brought them in alive." Wyatt dismounted, his body stiff from days in the saddle. "You said the territory wanted proper trials." "That I did." Mills signaled to his deputy to help secure the prisoners. "Carson will be pleased about his cattle, too. That's quite a job you've done, Jameson." Wyatt shrugged off the praise. "Just doing what I was paid for." As the sheriff led the rustlers inside, Wyatt became aware of someone watching him intently from across the street. Clara Johansson stood outside her office, medical bag in hand, as if she'd been on her way to a call when the commotion caught her attention. Their eyes met briefly, and Wyatt felt that same uncomfortable jolt he'd experienced the first time. He quickly looked away, busying himself with Midnight's saddle. "Mr. Jameson." He hadn't heard her approach, a rare lapse in his usually hyper-aware state. Clara stood a few feet away, studying him with that direct gaze that seemed to see too much. "Doctor," he acknowledged, not looking up from his task. "You've returned sooner than expected," she observed, "and with results, I see." Wyatt finally straightened, finding it impossible to ignore her completely without seeming outright rude. "Job's done." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in his appearance. "You're favoring your left side. Are you injured?" "It's nothing," he replied automatically, though in truth his side had been troubling him since a fall while rounding up the scattered cattle. "Just tired." Her skeptical expression made it clear she didn't believe him. "Well, should this nothing become something worth addressing, you know where to find me." Wyatt expected her to leave then, to continue on whatever errand she'd been undertaking. Instead, she remained, her expression softening slightly. The Wilson boy made a full recovery, by the way. His father even managed a grudging thank you before they left town. Despite himself, Wyatt felt pleased at this news. Good. The boy deserved a chance. "As do you," Clara said unexpectedly. Wyatt frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning that ignoring injuries doesn't make one stronger, Mr. Jameson. It merely increases the likelihood of permanent damage." She held his gaze steadily. "My office hours end at 7. Should you decide that professional attention might be preferable to stubborn self-neglect." With that, she turned and continued on her way, leaving Wyatt to stare after her in a mixture of irritation and bewilderment. No one spoke to him that way directly, without fear or deference, as if he were just an ordinary man, not the ghost that others whispered about. Wyatt finished securing Midnight at the livery stable, arranged for Carson's foreman to collect the recovered cattle, and made his way to the hotel. A hot bath, a meal, and rest were all he needed. His side would heal on its own, as countless other injuries had over the years. Yet as evening approached, Wyatt found himself standing outside Clara's office, the lamp still lit inside indicating she was there as promised. He hadn't planned to come, had told himself repeatedly that he didn't need medical attention. But something, curiosity perhaps, or the persistent ache in his side had drawn him here anyway. Before he could change his mind, he knocked on the door. Clara's voice called from within. "Come in." Wyatt entered to find her at her desk, writing in what appeared to be a patient journal. She looked up, surprise briefly crossing her features before being replaced by a small, satisfied smile. "Mr. Jameson, I'm glad you decided to be sensible." He almost turned around and left right then, but the genuine warmth in her expression stopped him. "I took a fall," he admitted reluctantly. "Ribs are sore." Clara stood, gesturing toward the examination room. "Let's have a look then." In the small back room, lit by oil lamps that cast a warm glow, Wyatt felt suddenly out of place. This was a space of healing, of vulnerability. Things he'd avoided for years. "You'll need to remove your shirt," Clara instructed, her tone matter of fact as she washed her hands in a basin. Wyatt hesitated, then complied, wincing slightly as he lifted the garment over his head. Clara turned back to find him bare to the waist, revealing not only the fresh bruising along his left side but numerous scars from old injuries, a roadmap of a violent life. If she was shocked or disturbed by the sight, she gave no indication. Instead, she approached with professional detachment, her fingers gently probing the bruised area. "Breathe deeply," she instructed. Wyatt complied, suppressing a grimace at the sharp pain. "2 ribs cracked, I believe, though not severely displaced," Clara diagnosed after a thorough examination. "You're fortunate it wasn't worse. A complete break could have punctured a lung." "Told you it was nothing," Wyatt said, reaching for his shirt. Clara placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "I'm not finished, Mr. Jameson. The ribs need binding to prevent further injury while they heal." Her touch on his bare skin was startling, warm, firm, and entirely clinical. Yet Wyatt couldn't remember the last time anyone had touched him without violence or fear as the motivation. "Is that necessary?" he asked, uncomfortable with the prolonged contact. "If you'd prefer weeks of pain instead of days, by all means, refuse treatment," Clara replied dryly. "Otherwise, sit still and let me do my job." There was that directness again, that refusal to be intimidated by his gruff manner. Wyatt found himself complying, sitting quietly as she efficiently wrapped bandages around his torso, her movements practiced and precise. "You've treated many broken ribs?" he asked, more to distract himself from the strange intimacy of the moment than from genuine curiosity. "More than I can count," Clara replied. "They're common injuries in Boston hospitals. Falls, accidents, fights." She secured the bandage and stepped back. "There. That should provide support while the bones heal." Wyatt carefully put his shirt back on, noticing that the binding did indeed make breathing less painful. "What do I owe you?" Clara moved to wash her hands again. $3 is my usual fee for treatment and materials." He placed the coins on the examination table, then hesitated. "Thank you," he said finally, the words feeling rusty from disuse. Clara turned, drying her hands on a clean towel. "You're welcome, Mr. Jameson, though I'd prefer if my patients sought help before injuries became more serious." "I'm not in the habit of seeking help," Wyatt admitted. "Yes, I gathered that from the collection of poorly healed scars." Her expression softened slightly. "There's no virtue in unnecessary suffering, you know." Something about her words struck deeper than Wyatt expected, touching on truths he'd avoided for years. He looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "Will you be staying in Riverton now that your job is complete?" Clara asked, changing the subject. Wyatt had been asking himself the same question. His original plan to move on suddenly seemed less certain. "Haven't decided," he said truthfully. Clara nodded, as if his answer confirmed something for her. "Well, should you stay, I'd appreciate it if you'd check in next week so I can assess how those ribs are healing." It was a transparent attempt to ensure he didn't disappear, and both of them knew it. Yet Wyatt found himself nodding in agreement. "I might do that," he said, moving toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Jameson," Clara called after him. "Do try to avoid falling off horses for at least a few days." Despite himself, Wyatt felt the corner of his mouth twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "No promises, Doctor." As he stepped back into the cool evening air, Wyatt was struck by the realization that, for the first time in years, the thought of staying in one place didn't fill him with restless dread. It was a small shift, barely perceptible, but significant nonetheless, like the first crack in a dam that had held back emotions for far too long. The week that followed brought unexpected changes to Wyatt's routine. Rather than taking another job immediately, he found reasons to remain in Riverton. Midnight needed rest after the hard journey. The hotel was comfortable. Sheriff Mills mentioned possible work in the future. All legitimate reasons that Wyatt repeated to himself, steadfastly avoiding the truth that he was curious about Clara Johansson in a way he hadn't been curious about anyone in years. He observed her from a distance, noting how she moved through town with purpose, medical bag always at hand. People were beginning to accept her, especially after Tommy Wilson's recovery. Even Frank Wilson himself now touched his hat respectfully when she passed. Wyatt took his meals at the hotel restaurant, occasionally exchanging brief words with other diners but mostly keeping to himself as usual. Yet he found himself noticing when Clara came in for her evening meal, often accompanied by Mrs. Wilkins, or sometimes alone with a medical journal for company. On the 5th day after his return, Clara spotted him in his corner table and, to his surprise, approached with her dinner tray. "May I join you, Mr. Jameson?" she asked. "Or would you prefer solitude?" Wyatt hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Suit yourself." Clara sat, arranging her skirts with practiced ease. "How are your ribs feeling?" "Better," he admitted. The binding had helped, though he'd never say so directly. "I'm glad to hear it." She began eating her stew, seemingly comfortable with the silence that followed. Wyatt studied her surreptitiously. Up close, he could see signs of fatigue in the slight shadows beneath her eyes, the way she occasionally stifled a yawn. "Busy day?" he asked finally, surprising himself by initiating conversation. Clara looked up, equally surprised. "Yes, actually. Mrs. Peterson's twins decided to arrive a month early. Healthy, thankfully, but it was a long night and day. You deliver babies too, of course. A rural physician must be prepared for everything." She took a sip of her tea. "What about you? Have you found new employment?" Wyatt shook his head. "Taking some time. The Carson job paid well." "I see." Clara's expression remained neutral, though he thought he detected a hint of satisfaction. "Riverton grows on people, I've found. Even after just a few weeks, I'm beginning to feel at home here." "It's just a town," Wyatt said, though without his usual conviction. Clara smiled slightly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's the people who make a place worth staying for." The conversation shifted to other topics, the changing spring weather, the upcoming town council meeting where Clara hoped to propose improvements to the town's sanitation, the news from back east that traveled westward in bits and pieces. To Wyatt's surprise, he found the conversation not unpleasant. Clara was intelligent and well-informed, with opinions on everything from politics to literature, yet she didn't seem to judge his more limited formal education. Instead, she listened with genuine interest to his observations about the territories he'd traveled through, the changes he'd seen on the frontier over the years. "You've led quite a life, Mr. Jameson," she remarked as they finished their meal. "Just moving from one place to another," he replied dismissively. "Nothing remarkable." Clara studied him thoughtfully. "I disagree. Few people have seen what you've seen, experienced what you've experienced. That perspective is valuable." Wyatt shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Experience hasn't made me wise, Doctor, just cautious." "Perhaps too cautious," she suggested gently. In some respects, before he could respond to that loaded statement, Clara rose from the table. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Jameson. I should get some rest before I'm called out again." "Of course," Wyatt replied, standing as well. "Good night, Doctor." "Good night." She hesitated, then added, "I still expect you to come by tomorrow for that check-up on your ribs." Despite himself, Wyatt felt that strange twitch at the corner of his mouth again. "I remember." As she walked away, Wyatt realized that for nearly an hour he had been fully engaged in the present moment, not haunted by the past or anxious about the future. It was a sensation so unfamiliar that he almost didn't recognize it for what it was, a small moment of peace. True to his word, Wyatt presented himself at Clara's office the following afternoon. She examined his ribs, pronounced them healing well, and rewrapped the bandages with that same clinical efficiency. "Another week of binding should be sufficient," she told him. "After that, you'll need to be careful, but the ribs should continue healing on their own." Wyatt nodded, buttoning his shirt. Planning to stick around that long, the question surprised both of them. Wyatt hadn't intended to ask it, and Clara clearly hadn't expected him to. "Yes, I believe I am," he said finally. "Sheriff Mills mentioned possible work escorting a gold shipment next week." Clara's expression brightened slightly. "That's good news. Riverton could use someone with your skills on a more permanent basis." "Didn't say anything about permanent," Wyatt cautioned. "Of course not," Clara agreed, though her smile suggested she wasn't convinced. "Still, it's nice to have patients who keep their follow-up appointments." Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged that would have astonished anyone who knew Wyatt's reputation. He remained in Riverton, taking the escort job when it came up, but otherwise occupying himself with small repairs to Midnight's tack, long rides in the surrounding countryside, and increasingly regular conversations with Clara. They weren't planned meetings, exactly. Sometimes he would encounter her on her rounds and walk alongside her for a block or two. Other times, she would join him for a meal at the hotel restaurant. Occasionally, they would both find themselves on the hotel porch in the evening, watching the sunset over the distant mountains. It was during one such evening that Clara finally asked the question Wyatt had been dreading. "Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you had a family once," she said quietly, her eyes on the fading light rather than his face. "I'm sorry for your loss." Wyatt stiffened, his instinct to shut down the conversation immediate and powerful. Yet something, perhaps the genuine compassion in her voice, or the fact that she hadn't demanded details, made him hesitate. "It was a long time ago," he said finally, his voice rough. Clara nodded, still not looking at him. Time doesn't always heal as completely as we'd like. The simple truth of her statement, free of platitudes or forced optimism, loosened something in Wyatt's chest. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. "My wife's name was Sarah," Wyatt said suddenly, surprising himself. "She was kind, stronger than she looked, had to be to follow me out here from Pennsylvania." Clara remained silent, offering him space to continue or stop as he chose. "We had a daughter, Elizabeth. She was just 2 when." He trailed off, the memories threatening to overwhelm him. "You don't have to tell me," Clara said gently. Wyatt took a deep breath. "Comanche raid." "I was away, hunting. Came back to find nothing left." The stark simplicity of the statement belied the horror of what he discovered that day, the images that still haunted his dreams. Clara's hand moved to cover his where it rested on the porch railing. Her touch was light but steady, offering comfort without demanding response. "I'm so sorry, Wyatt," she said, using his first name for the first time. They stood together as darkness fell, neither speaking further. Yet in that silence, something shifted between them, a barrier lowered, a connection formed through shared understanding of loss and survival. When Clara finally withdrew her hand and bid him good night, Wyatt remained on the porch long after she'd gone, his thoughts in turmoil. He had not spoken of Sarah and Elizabeth in years, had deliberately avoided forming attachments that might lead to such conversations. Yet here he was, having revealed his most closely guarded pain to a woman he'd known barely a month. More disturbing still was the realization that the sharing had not destroyed him, as he'd always feared it might. Instead, he felt oddly lightened, as if by speaking their names aloud he had honored their memory in a way his silent grieving never had. Sleep eluded him that night, his mind replaying not the terrible memories of loss but earlier, happier times, Sarah laughing as they made plans for their western adventure, Elizabeth taking her first toddling steps across a cabin floor. Memories he'd buried alongside his heart, now unearthed by a doctor's gentle patience. The following morning, Wyatt made a decision. He would complete the escort job for Sheriff Mills, then move on as he always did. Clara Johansson was dangerous not in the way outlaws and rustlers were dangerous, but in a far more insidious manner. She made him want things he'd convinced himself were forever beyond reach. Hope was a luxury Wyatt Jameson couldn't afford, not when he knew how cruelly it could be snatched away. Yet even as he made this resolution, Wyatt knew it lacked conviction. Something had awakened in him, something he'd thought long dead, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to bury it again. The gold shipment escort job proved more dangerous than anticipated. What should have been a routine trip to the bank in Laramie was complicated by an ambush just outside Riverton. 3 men in masks, well armed and determined, emerged from a gully as Wyatt and the bank manager, Mr. Patterson, passed by in the reinforced wagon. Wyatt's instincts saved them. He'd sensed something wrong moments before the attack, drawing his weapon in time to fire at the first assailant. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. The other 2 opened fire, bullets splintering the wagon's wooden sides. "Get down!" Wyatt shouted to Patterson, who needed no encouragement to huddle on the wagon floor beside the strongbox. What followed was a brief but intense gun battle. Wyatt managed to wound a second attacker, but the third got off a lucky shot that grazed Wyatt's upper arm before retreating with his injured companion. "Are you all right?" Patterson asked shakily as the sounds of hoofbeats faded. "Fine," Wyatt replied automatically, though blood was already soaking through his shirt sleeve. "But we've got one of them." He nodded toward the first attacker, who lay moaning in the dust. They secured the wounded man in the wagon and continued to Laramie without further incident. After delivering both the gold and the would-be robber to the proper authorities, they began the journey back to Riverton. "You should see a doctor for that arm," Patterson suggested as they approached town late the following day. "It's still bleeding." Wyatt had bound the wound with a bandana, but it throbbed persistently. "It's nothing," he said, though without his usual conviction. The truth was, the thought of seeing Clara again created a conflicting mixture of anticipation and dread. Word of the attempted robbery had preceded them. Sheriff Mills was waiting at the edge of town, along with a small crowd of curious onlookers, including Clara, who stepped forward as soon as she saw the blood-stained bandana around Wyatt's arm. "Mr. Jameson is injured," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "He'll need to come to my office immediately." Mills nodded in agreement. "Patterson can give me the details. You go get that arm looked at, Jameson." Too tired to argue, Wyatt allowed Clara to lead him to her office. Inside, she helped him remove his coat and shirt, revealing the ugly furrow where the bullet had torn through flesh without hitting bone or major blood vessels. "You're fortunate," she remarked as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic. "Half an inch deeper and this could have severed an artery." Wyatt winced at the sting of the medicine. Luck was on my side. "This time," Clara agreed, her tone sharpening, "but luck is a poor substitute for caution." As she worked, stitching the wound with neat, precise movements, Wyatt found himself studying her face, the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated, the determined set of her mouth. She was beautiful in a quiet way that had nothing to do with conventional standards, and everything to do with the intelligence and compassion that animated her features. "I've been thinking of moving on," he said abruptly. "After this job." Clara's hands paused momentarily before resuming their work. "I see," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "May I ask why?" Wyatt looked away. "It's what I do, never stay in one place too long." "And why is that?" she pressed, finishing the last stitch and beginning to bandage his arm. "You know why," he said quietly. "After what happened to Sarah and Elizabeth, attachments are dangerous." Clara secured the bandage and moved to wash her hands, her back to him. "Dangerous for whom, Wyatt? For others or for yourself?" The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortably perceptive. When she turned back to face him, her expression was gentle but unflinching. "Loss is always possible," she continued. "In my profession, I see it daily, but that possibility doesn't diminish the value of connection. If anything, it makes each moment more precious." "Easy to say," Wyatt muttered, reaching for his shirt. "Harder to live with." "Yes," Clara agreed unexpectedly. "It is hard, terribly hard. But the alternative, living half a life, always running from the possibility of both pain and joy, is that truly living at all?" Her words struck too close to truths Wyatt had been avoiding. He finished dressing in silence, unsure how to respond. "You don't have to answer that now," Clara said, her voice softening. "But I hope you'll consider it before you decide to leave." As he stood to go, Wyatt found himself face to face with her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, to catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothing. "Why do you care?" he asked finally. "What happens to me?" Clara held his gaze steadily. "Because despite your best efforts to convince yourself otherwise, Wyatt Jameson, you are very much alive, and lives of value deserve to be fully lived." Before he could respond, she reached up and touched his cheek briefly, her fingers cool against his skin. "Come back tomorrow so I can check that wound. Doctor's orders." Stunned by both her words and her touch, Wyatt could only nod before making his escape into the gathering dusk. That night, lying awake in his hotel room, Wyatt confronted the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. He was drawn to Clara Johansson not just to her beauty or intelligence, but to the life force that animated her, the unwavering commitment to healing others even when they resisted her help. Especially then. For years, he had existed rather than lived, moving from place to place, job to job, with nothing to anchor him. The ghost, people called him, and he had embraced the name, finding comfort in emotional numbness, in the absence of connections that could be severed by violence or fate. But Clara saw through that carefully constructed facade. She saw the man he had been and could be again, if he found the courage. And that terrified him more than any gunfight. Morning brought no clarity, but it did bring Sheriff Mills with unexpected news. "Got a telegram from Laramie," he explained when Wyatt met him for coffee. "That robber you captured has been talking. Says he was hired by someone in town to hit that gold shipment." Wyatt frowned. "Someone in Riverton," Mills nodded grimly. "That's what he claims. Won't give a name, but says his boss knew exactly when the shipment was leaving and what route you'd take." "That information wasn't widely known," Wyatt observed. "Just you, me, Patterson. And the bank board," Mills finished. 6 men, all respectable citizens. Hard to believe any of them would be involved in something like this. "Money makes men do surprising things," Wyatt said, thinking of the countless crimes he'd witnessed over the years, often committed by those who already had more than enough. Mills sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I'm heading to Laramie tomorrow to question this fellow myself. In the meantime, keep your eyes open. If someone in town organized this robbery, they might not take kindly to your interference." The warning should have reinforced Wyatt's decision to leave Riverton behind. Instead, he found himself reluctant to go while a potential threat remained not just to himself, but to the town, to Clara. "I'll stay alert," he promised Mills, "and I'll be here when you get back." The sheriff raised an eyebrow at this unexpected commitment, but merely nodded before taking his leave. Later that morning, Wyatt kept his appointment at Clara's office, allowing her to check his wound and change the bandage. Their conversation remained professional, neither mentioning their more personal exchange from the previous evening. Yet Wyatt was acutely aware of her presence, of the gentle strength in her hands as she tended his injury. "It's healing well," she pronounced. "Keep it clean and dry. Come back in 2 days." "I will," Wyatt promised, surprising both of them with his ready agreement. Clara looked as if she might say more, then thought better of it. "Good day, Mr. Jameson." "Good day, Doctor." He paused at the door. "Be careful, Clara." Sheriff thinks the robbery attempt might have had local connections. Her expression softened at his concern. "I'm always careful, Wyatt, but thank you for the warning." As the days passed, Wyatt found himself becoming more integrated into Riverton's daily life than he'd ever intended. He took his meals regularly at the hotel, exchanged greetings with shopkeepers, even attended a town meeting where Clara successfully argued for improvements to the water supply to prevent disease. He also kept watch, observing the 6 members of the bank board as they went about their business. Most seemed unremarkable: Patterson, the bank manager, Johnson, the general store owner, Wilson, the rancher who had opposed Clara treating his son, Judge Parker, Reverend Thomas, and Harold, the hotel owner. Of these, Harold seemed the least likely suspect. His business was thriving, and he had a genuine affection for the town. Wilson was wealthy enough from his ranch not to need stolen gold. The others were more difficult to assess. On the 3rd day of his unofficial investigation, Wyatt noticed Judge Parker engaged in an intense conversation with David, the young telegraph operator, behind the general store. Both men looked furtive, and they separated quickly when they realized Wyatt had spotted them. Curious, Wyatt made his way to the telegraph office later that afternoon, timing his visit when David stepped out for a late lunch. "Need to send a message?" the assistant operator asked. "Actually, I was wondering if there had been any telegrams for me," Wyatt improvised. "From Sheriff Mills in Laramie." The young man checked the records. "Nothing today, sir, but there was a message from Laramie for Judge Parker this morning, marked urgent." Wyatt thanked him and left, his suspicions growing. Judge Parker had been on the circuit when the gold shipment was planned. How had he known about it, unless someone had informed him? And why would he need urgent communications from Laramie, where the captured robber was being held? That evening, as dusk fell over Riverton, Wyatt made his way toward the judge's house on the outskirts of town. He had no clear plan, just a growing certainty that something wasn't right. He was passing Clara's office when the door opened suddenly, and she emerged, medical bag in hand, clearly responding to an emergency call. "Clara," he said, stepping out of the shadows. She started, then relaxed when she recognized him. "Wyatt, you startled me. Where are you going at this hour?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Judge Parker sent word that his housekeeper has taken ill," Clara explained, already moving toward the street. "High fever, possible pneumonia." Alarm bells rang in Wyatt's mind. "I'll come with you," Clara frowned. "That's hardly necessary." "It is," Wyatt insisted, falling into step beside her. "I don't trust the situation." Something in his tone must have conveyed his seriousness, for Clara didn't argue further. They walked in silence toward the judge's house, a substantial 2-story structure set back from the road, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. No lamps were lit inside, Wyatt noticed immediately. Strange for a house with an ill occupant. "Wait," he said softly, catching Clara's arm as she was about to knock. "Something's wrong." Before she could respond, the door swung open, revealing Judge Parker himself, a revolver in his hand. "Miss Johansson, right on time," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "And Mr. Jameson, too." "How convenient." Wyatt's hand moved toward his holster, but the judge shook his head. "I wouldn't. David has a clear shot from the window. Make a move for that gun and the good doctor gets a bullet. Clara's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. Judge Parker, what is the meaning of this? Simple necessity, my dear. Your unexpected companion has been asking too many questions, and you, unfortunately, have become a complication. Understanding dawned on Wyatt. You organized the robbery. There is no sick housekeeper. Parker smiled thinly. Very good, Mr. Jameson. Yes, I arranged it. The territory pays judges poorly, you see, and I have certain expensive obligations back east. That gold shipment was to be my solution. Until I stopped your men, Wyatt concluded. A temporary setback, Parker assured him. But now I face a more serious problem. Your captured associate is talking to Sheriff Mills as we speak. And you plan to be gone before they return, Wyatt guessed. But why involve Clara? Parker gestured them inside with the gun. Insurance, initially. Hostages can be useful. But I'm afraid neither of you will be leaving this house alive. A tragic murder-suicide will be discovered tomorrow. The mysterious drifter who became obsessed with our new doctor, only to kill her when she rejected his advances. Clara's eyes widened. No one would believe that. They'll believe the evidence they find, Parker said confidently. Now, inside, both of you. Wyatt's mind raced as they entered the darkened house. David, the telegraph operator, stood by the window with a rifle. No sign of the housekeeper, likely sent away on some pretext. Hands where I can see them, Jameson, Parker ordered. David, take his gun. The young man approached nervously, removing Wyatt's Colt and backing away quickly. Judge, this is madness, Clara said, her voice remarkably calm despite the circumstances. Murder will only compound your troubles. Parker shrugged. On the contrary, it solves them quite neatly. By the time the truth emerges, if it ever does, I'll be far from here with a new identity. Wyatt assessed their options. Two armed men, both nervous but determined. The door behind them, the stairs ahead leading to the upper floor. Windows on either side. Limited cover. David, he said suddenly, addressing the younger man. You're making a mistake. Attempted robbery is one thing, murder is another. They hang men for that. David's grip on the rifle tightened. Shut up. The judge has it all planned out. Plans fail, Wyatt pressed. Ask his men who tried to rob us. One's in jail, the other's probably halfway to Mexico by now. Enough talking, Parker snapped. David, take the doctor upstairs. I'll deal with Jameson first. This was their chance. Separation would make resistance more difficult. As David moved toward Clara, Wyatt caught her eye, giving a subtle nod toward the heavy medical bag she still clutched. Understanding flashed between them. As David reached for her arm, Clara swung the bag with surprising force, catching him full in the face. Simultaneously, Wyatt lunged for Parker, deflecting the gun as it discharged, the bullet splintering wood instead of flesh. What followed was a desperate struggle in the dim house. Wyatt grappled with Parker, eventually wresting the revolver from his grasp. Clara had managed to knock David unconscious with a second blow from her bag, which Wyatt later learned contained not only medical instruments but several heavy reference books. Are you hurt? Wyatt asked urgently, moving to Clara's side once Parker was secured. No, she assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. I'm fine. He couldn't resist touching her cheek briefly, reassuring himself that she was truly unharmed. You were brave. As were you, she replied, leaning briefly into his touch before straightening. What now? Now we wait for Sheriff Mills to return, Wyatt said, keeping his revolver trained on the judge. I think he'll be very interested in what Judge Parker has to say. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Sheriff Mills returned the following day, confirming through telegrams with Laramie that the captured robber had indeed implicated Judge Parker. Both the judge and David were arrested and transported to the territorial capital for trial. Clara's quick thinking and courage earned her new respect from the townspeople, cementing her position as Riverton's doctor beyond any remaining doubts. And Wyatt, to his own surprise, found himself regarded not as the ghost, the dangerous drifter, but as someone who had protected one of their own. A week after the incident, as spring gave way to early summer, Wyatt sat on the hotel porch, watching the evening activity along Main Street. His arm had healed well, thanks to Clara's care. His ribs no longer troubled him. There was nothing physical keeping him in Riverton any longer. Yet he remained, taking odd jobs for Sheriff Mills, helping Harold repair the hotel's roof, even assisting the schoolteacher with riding lessons for older students. Small connections, tentative roots in a community he'd never planned to join. Clara found him there, as she often did at this hour. She sat beside him without speaking, seemingly content to share the silence as they watched the sunset paint the western sky. "I received a letter from the territorial governor today," she said finally, "commending my bravery in the face of criminal conspiracy." Rather grandiose language for swinging a medical bag, don't you think? Wyatt smiled slightly. "I don't know. That was a pretty impressive swing." She laughed, the sound warming something deep inside him. "Well, I had an excellent example of courage to follow." Their eyes met, and Wyatt felt that now familiar jolt, no longer uncomfortable but welcome, like the recognition of something precious. "I haven't left," he said abruptly. Clara's expression softened. "I've noticed. I keep telling myself I should. That staying in one place too long is dangerous. And yet you remain," she observed. "Why is that, Wyatt?" He looked out at the town, considering his answer carefully. "Maybe because for the first time in years, leaving feels more dangerous than staying." Clara's hand found his on the porch railing, her fingers intertwining with his. "That sounds like progress to me." Wyatt turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who had walked into his life and refused to be intimidated by his defenses, who had seen the man behind the ghost and patiently waited for him to see himself. "I can't promise I'm fixed," he warned her. "There are still days when the memories come back hard." "I would never ask you to forget them," Clara replied gently. "Sarah and Elizabeth are part of who you are, but perhaps there's room in your heart for new memories too." The simplicity of her understanding undid him. Without overthinking, Wyatt leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that she returned with equal tenderness. When they parted, Wyatt felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope, fragile but undeniable, like the first green shoot after a long winter. "I'm not good at this," he admitted quietly. "Being with someone, trusting that they won't be taken away." Clara smiled, touching his face with gentle fingers. "Then it's fortunate that I have an abundance of patience, isn't it?" In that moment, Wyatt Jameson, the man they called the Ghost, the drifter who never stayed, the cowboy whose heart had been buried alongside his family, felt something stir within him that he'd thought forever dead. Not just desire or affection, but the capacity for joy, for a future beyond mere survival. It would take time, he knew. There would be setbacks, moments when fear threatened to overwhelm hope. But looking into Clara's eyes, he believed for the first time that healing was possible, not despite his scars, but with them, acknowledged and accepted as part of his story. "Patience," he echoed, taking her hand in his. "I think I could learn to appreciate that quality." Clara's answering smile held all the promise of dawn after the longest night. "Then let's begin, shall we?" And so they did, one day at a time, building something neither had expected to find in Riverton, Wyoming territory, a second chance at love, made possible by a woman's unwavering patience and a man's courage to let his heart come back to life. As summer bloomed across the Wyoming landscape, Riverton witnessed a gradual transformation in the man they had once called the Ghost. Wyatt Jameson remained reserved by nature, a man of few words and careful actions. But the invisible wall that had separated him from others began to crumble, brick by brick, under Clara's patient influence. Their courtship progressed slowly, deliberately. Wyatt walked Clara home in the evenings after her office hours. They took Sunday rides into the countryside, picnicking by the Sweetwater River. Sometimes they simply sat together on the hotel porch, talking or sharing comfortable silence as the day ended. For Clara, each small revelation about Wyatt was a victory, the dry humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. His surprising knowledge of literature, gleaned from years of solitary reading during long trails, his gentle way with injured animals brought to her for treatment. For Wyatt, each day brought both joy and terror, the happiness of connection balanced against the fear of loss. Some mornings he woke in a cold sweat, convinced that loving Clara would somehow invite tragedy. On those days, he withdrew into himself, retreating to the familiar safety of emotional distance. But Clara, true to her word, responded with patience rather than frustration. She gave him space when he needed it, gentle encouragement when he was ready to return. "Healing isn't linear," she told him during one such episode, after he'd avoided her for 2 days following a particularly vivid nightmare. "Any doctor knows that progress comes with setbacks." "You deserve better," Wyatt had responded, shame evident in his averted gaze. "Someone whole." Clara had taken his face in her hands then, forcing him to meet her eyes. "No one is whole, Wyatt. We're all broken in different ways. What matters is that we're trying to heal." By midsummer, Wyatt had established himself as Riverton's unofficial lawman when Sheriff Mills was away on circuit duties. He had a natural authority that commanded respect, and his reputation as a skilled tracker made troublemakers think twice about causing problems. Clara's medical practice flourished as well. With her uncle's foundation to build upon and her own considerable skills, she won over even the most skeptical patients. When an outbreak of scarlet fever threatened the town's children, Clara worked tirelessly, saving all but one, a frail infant who had been sickly from birth. Wyatt found her in her office after that loss, weeping quietly over the small body she had been unable to save. Without words, he gathered her into his arms, offering the same comfort she had so often extended to him. "Sometimes we lose," she whispered against his chest, "no matter how hard we try." "Yes," he agreed, stroking her hair, "but that doesn't mean the trying wasn't worth it." Hearing his own words an echo of what Clara had been telling him for months, Wyatt realized how far he had come. The walls around his heart hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had windows now, and doors that he was learning to open. As summer faded into autumn, bringing crisp nights and golden days, Wyatt faced a decision. The territorial governor, impressed by reports of his handling of the Judge Parker case, had offered him a position as deputy marshal, a job that would require regular travel throughout Wyoming. In the past, such an offer would have been ideal, meaningful work that allowed him to remain rootless. Now, the thought of leaving Riverton, of leaving Clara, filled him with unexpected dread. "You should consider it," Clara told him when he shared the news. They were walking by the river, leaves crunching beneath their boots. "It's an honorable position, and you'd be excellent at it." Wyatt studied her profile, wondering if she was testing him somehow. "It would mean being away for weeks at a time." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes. But Riverton would still be here. I would still be here." The simple certainty of her statement touched something deep within him. "Would you wait?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "For a man who comes and goes." Clara stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Wyatt Jameson, I've been waiting for you since the moment I saw you watching me arrive on that stagecoach. The real question is, what are you waiting for?" The directness of her question, so typical of Clara, left nowhere to hide. Wyatt took her hands in his, marveling at how small they seemed against his calloused palms, yet how capable they were hands that had saved lives, including, in a way, his own. "I'm afraid," he admitted, the confession both painful and liberating. "Not of loving you that happened despite my best efforts to prevent it. I'm afraid of building something only to see it destroyed again." Clara squeezed his hands gently. "That fear never goes away entirely," she said. "I feel it too when you ride out with the sheriff. I've lost people I cared about, my parents to influenza, my brother in the war. Loss is part of living." "How do you bear it?" he asked, genuinely needing to know. "By remembering that grief is the price we pay for love, and it's a price worth paying." Her eyes, direct as always, held his. "I would rather love you and risk losing you than never love you at all. Wouldn't you say the same?" The truth of her words resonated in places long closed off. Wyatt thought of Sarah, of the joy they had shared despite its tragic end. Would he erase those years if it meant erasing the pain that followed? The answer came with surprising clarity: no, he wouldn't. In that moment, something shifted inside Wyatt Jameson, a final acceptance that life offered no guarantees, only choices. And he was choosing Clara, choosing love despite its risks. "Yes," he said finally, "I would." The smile that illuminated her face was worth every moment of fear he had endured. Wyatt pulled her close, kissing her with a new freedom, unburdened by the ghosts of the past. "I love you, Clara Johansson," he said when they parted, the words feeling both strange and right on his tongue. "I think I have since you faced down Frank Wilson without flinching." Clara laughed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And I love you, Wyatt Jameson, though I think I've been more patient about admitting it." Their laughter mingled in the crisp autumn air, a sound of joy that neither had expected to find again. 2 weeks later, with Clara's encouragement, Wyatt accepted the deputy marshal position, with one condition: that Riverton remain his home base between assignments. The territorial governor, eager to secure his services, readily agreed. The arrangement proved better than either had anticipated. Wyatt's duties took him away regularly, but rarely for more than 2 weeks at a time. Each return to Riverton to Clara felt like coming home in a way he had not experienced since losing his family. In November, after returning from a particularly challenging assignment tracking fugitives through early mountain snow, Wyatt made another decision. With uncharacteristic nervousness, he approached Harold about purchasing a small piece of land on the outskirts of town, a plot with a view of both the mountains and the river. Planning to put down roots at last? Harold asked with a knowing smile as they completed the transaction. "Seems that way," Wyatt admitted, still somewhat surprised by the turn his life had taken. That evening he took Clara to see the property, watching her face as she took in the location. "It's beautiful," she said, turning in a slow circle to appreciate the views. "A perfect spot for a home." "Our home," Wyatt clarified, his heart pounding as he reached for her hand. "If you'll have me, Clara," her eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Wyatt Jameson, are you proposing marriage?" "Not very skillfully," he acknowledged with a rueful smile. "But yes, I love you, Clara. I want to build a life with you right here. I can't promise it will be easy. My job has risks, and I'm still learning how to be the man you deserve. But I promise to try every day." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt." The kiss they shared sealed more than just a promise of marriage. It marked the completion of a journey that had begun the moment. Clara stepped off the stagecoach and caught the eye of a man who thought his heart was dead. Their wedding took place on Christmas Eve in Riverton's small church, decorated with evergreen boughs and candles for the holiday. Sheriff Mills stood as Wyatt's best man, while Mrs. Wilkins attended Clara. The entire town turned out for the occasion. many still marveling at the transformation of the man they had once feared as the ghost. Frank Wilson, whose son Tommy was now a robust youth thanks to Clara's skill, approached them at the reception with unexpected humility. "I was wrong about you, Doctor," he admitted gruffly. "Both of you, really. You've done right by this town. I wish you happiness." Clara accepted the belated apology with grace. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'm glad we were able to move beyond our differences." As winter settled over Riverton, Clara and Wyatt began their married life in rooms above her medical office while their house was being built. The arrangement suited them. Clara could respond quickly to emergencies, and Wyatt could come and go as his deputy marshal duties required without disturbing the household. Their home was completed in early spring, a sturdy two-story structure built to withstand Wyoming's harsh weather. Clara furnished it with a mixture of pieces ordered from catalogs and local craftsmanship, creating a warm space that reflected both her Eastern refinement and Wyatt's frontier practicality. Through it all, their love deepened, strengthened by the honest communication they had established from the beginning. Wyatt still had difficult days when memories resurfaced, but they no longer sent him running. Instead, he shared them with Clara, who listened without judgment and offered comfort without platitudes. In June, exactly 1 year after Clara had arrived in Riverton, she shared news that both thrilled and terrified Wyatt. They were expecting a child. "Are you happy?" she asked, watching his face carefully after telling him. Wyatt's emotions warred within him: joy at the prospect of fatherhood again, terror at the thought of loving another child who could be lost. But looking into Clara's steady eyes, he found his answer. "Yes," he said, gathering her close. "Scared out of my wits, but happy." So happy, Clara. The months that followed tested Wyatt's newfound courage. Each of Clara's prenatal patients reminded him of risks he preferred not to contemplate. Each time he had to leave town on martial business, he worried about what might happen in his absence. But Clara, with her characteristic blend of patience and directness, refused to let fear overshadow their joy. "This child is already loved," she told him, guiding his hand to her growing belly. "That's all any of us can ask for, to be loved while we're here." When winter came again, bringing with it howling blizzards that isolated Riverton for days at a time, Clara's time drew near. Wyatt arranged to remain in town throughout January, unwilling to risk being absent when she needed him most. His foresight proved fortunate. On a night when snow piled high against the windows and wind moaned around the eaves, Clara went into labor. Mrs. Wilkins was summoned to assist, as was the midwife who had helped Clara with previous deliveries. Wyatt paced outside the bedroom door, each of Clara's cries cutting through him like a knife. The hours stretched endlessly as snow continued to fall, isolating them from the rest of the world. When Mrs. Wilkins finally emerged, her expression grave, Wyatt's heart nearly stopped. "The baby is breech," she explained quietly. "Clara says you should come in now." Inside the bedroom, Clara lay propped against pillows, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear and determined. She managed a smile when Wyatt took her hand. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious pain. "The baby is positioned feet first. It's dangerous, but I know what needs to be done. I need you to help, Wyatt." Terror gripped him. "Clara, I don't know how I do," she interrupted, "and I'll tell you exactly what to do. Mrs. Wilkins and Martha will assist, but I need your strength. Can you do this, Wyatt? Can you be brave for us?" Looking into her eyes, seeing the trust there alongside the fear, Wyatt found strength he didn't know he possessed. "Yes," he promised. "Tell me what to do." What followed was the most harrowing and miraculous night of Wyatt's life. Following Clara's precise instructions, guided by her medical knowledge even through her own pain, he helped bring their child safely into the world, a son with a lusty cry that shattered the winter silence. "He's perfect," Clara whispered as the midwife placed the swaddled infant in her arms. "Look what we did, Wyatt." Wyatt gazed down at his wife and son, overwhelmed by love so intense it threatened to stop his breath. This woman had done the impossible, not just delivering their child under the most difficult circumstances, but delivering him, Wyatt, from the half-life he had been living when she found him. "What shall we name him?" Clara asked, stroking the baby's downy head. Wyatt considered for a moment, then said, "William, after my father, and Stephen after your uncle. William Stephen Jameson." Clara smiled her approval. "A good, strong name for a boy who's already proven he's a fighter." Later, as dawn broke over a world transformed by snow, Wyatt sat by the bedroom window, his son sleeping in his arms while Clara rested. The first rays of sunlight glinted on the pristine white landscape, creating a brilliance that was almost blinding. Life would never be without risks, Wyatt knew. The frontier remained dangerous. His work as a marshal exposed him to violent men, and no doctor, not even one as skilled as Clara, could guarantee health and safety for those they loved. But looking down at his son's peaceful face, Wyatt understood at last what Clara had been teaching him since the day they met, that a heart once dead could indeed be revived, and that love, despite its vulnerabilities, was always worth the courage it demanded. "Your mother saved me," he whispered to the sleeping infant. "With nothing but patience and a belief that I was worth saving, I'll try to be worthy of that gift every day for both of you." Outside, the snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, revealing the promise of renewal beneath winter's blanket. Inside, Wyatt Jameson, no longer the ghost but a husband, a father, a man fully alive, kept watch over his family, his heart beating strong with gratitude for second chances and the remarkable woman who had refused to give up on him. Years passed, seasons turning in their eternal cycle as Riverton grew from frontier town to established community. The railroad arrived, bringing new opportunities and challenges. Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, a milestone celebrated with particular pride by those who had helped shape the territory. Through it all, the Jamesons remained a cornerstone of Riverton life. Clara's medical practice expanded to include a small hospital, where she trained a succession of nurses and eventually a young doctor who became her partner. Wyatt continued his work as a deputy marshal until 1895, when he accepted the position of Riverton's sheriff following Mill's retirement. Their family grew as well. William, their firstborn, was joined by a sister, Sarah Elizabeth. 2 years later, a naming that acknowledged the past while embracing the future. In 1892, to their surprise and joy, twin boys completed their family, Robert and James, who brought equal measures of mischief and delight to the Jameson household. Life brought its share of sorrows alongside its joys. Mrs. Wilkins passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1894, mourned by the entire community but especially by Clara, who had come to regard the older woman as family. The winter of 1896 brought a diphtheria outbreak that claimed several lives despite Clara's tireless efforts. Yet through each challenge, Wyatt and Clara's bond only strengthened. The man who once believed his heart was dead learned not only to love again, but to live fully, to laugh with his children, to engage with his community, to face each day with the courage Clara had seen in him from the beginning. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1901, 25 years after Clara first arrived in Riverton, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching their youngest son splitting wood in the yard while their oldest, now a young man studying law in Cheyenne, wrote letters home of his progress. "Do you ever regret it?" Wyatt asked suddenly, taking Clara's hand in his. "Coming west, choosing this life, choosing me?" Clara turned to him with a smile that had only grown more beautiful to him over the years. At 50, her chestnut hair now showed streaks of silver, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, evidence of both laughter and concern for her patients. To Wyatt, she had never been more lovely. Not for a single moment, she assured him, squeezing his hand. Though I will admit, when I first saw you watching me from the shadows that day, I never imagined we'd end up here. Wyatt chuckled, the sound coming easily now after years of practice. You mean you didn't immediately envision a future with the town's resident ghost? Oh, I saw something in you right away, Clara corrected him. Not a ghost at all, but a man worth knowing, worth the patience it might take to know him. Wyatt brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of tenderness that had become natural over their years together. You were right about me needing patience. I didn't make it easy for you. The things most worth having rarely come easily, Clara replied with the wisdom that had guided her throughout their life together. Besides, you gave me exactly what I needed too. And what was that? Wyatt asked, genuinely curious. Roots, she said simply. A place to belong, a partner who values strength as well as tenderness, a family built on honesty and courage. She smiled up at him. Not bad for a Boston doctor who came west on a stagecoach, wouldn't you say? Wyatt looked out over their land, at the home they had built together, at the family they had created. The shadows of the past would always be part of him, Sarah and Elizabeth held in memory with love rather than just grief now. But the present and the future belonged to Clara and the life they shared. Not bad at all, he agreed, pulling her close as the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains. Though I think we both know who the brave one was in this story. Clara laughed, the sound still as captivating to him as it had been the first time he heard it. Perhaps we're both brave in different ways. I'd call that a fair partnership. As evening fell over Riverton, bringing with it the first crisp hint of another winter to come, Wyatt Jameson held his wife close and offered silent thanks for the woman whose patience had taught a broken man to live again, and for the heart he had once thought dead, now beating strong with the fullness of a life well lived and well loved.